George.
BBC Radio Kent.
It's exactly 10 minutes past 10. Good morning. It was a defining moment in history. The suffragette Emily Wilding Davison, who had in recent years been in prison and had led a very traumatic life, ran out in front of the horses racing in the 1913 Derby. She was struck by the King's horse. She died from her injuries 4 days later. But we know less about the jockey, the man who was riding the King's horse, a man called Herbert, fondly Bertie Jones. What happened to him? Well, Lesley Gray is telling his story. Lesley is a mature student at the University of Kent. She was intrigued. She decided to find out. And the result is her first novel, The King's Jockey. It's out next month. It is a novel, but it's based on real facts that Lesley discovered about the jockey who fleetingly made the headlines for all the wrong reasons. When I met Lesley yesterday, I asked her whose story she was drawn to initially, Emily's or Bertie's.
I was very interested in her story. I mean, we're brought up with Emily's sacrifice, and in no way did I want to demean what she did, because it was an amazing thing. But as I was actually working on a book, an A-level educational book about votes for women, and I was interested in Bertie because he was always a footnote. So there'd always be a little footnote in any books that I looked at which said, you know, Bertie Jones, the King's jockey, wasn't seriously hurt. He was used to falling off. And I thought, well, hang on. I mean, I'm sure he was used to falling off his horses, but he wasn't used to a woman running in front of his horse, being seriously injured and dying on him. So I was concerned that it needed to be explored. And there are a lot of ideas in our own society about, you know, is somebody a freedom fighter? Are they a terrorist? And also what happens to the people who are victims of those events. So that was really where I was coming from on the story.
Did you come to the conclusion that he is a victim or not?
I think that it's very difficult when somebody's up in public view and another person decides to do something that will impact their lives. And I'm very interested in the ideas that, you know, everything we do has impacts on other people. So I think to an extent he was a victim because he was just doing his job. He wasn't expecting to be involved or anything like that to happen. Just like a tube train driver that is driving along and someone decides to jump in front of them. And it must be so difficult to try to come to terms with that. You start to ask yourself, well, could I have done this? Could I have done that? Could I have done something to avoid it? And of course, you can only do what you can do at the time.
Do you think she went to the races that day with the intention of walking out in front of the King's horse and of dying as a consequence? Or do you think there's a more sophisticated version of that story?
I think there's a lot of debate about it. And I think that she wanted to make a grand gesture. She wanted a big statement that was very public. She had been so brutalised by the system, by her experiences in prison. She'd gone through force feeding. She'd tried to barricade herself into a cell once because she couldn't stand the screams of the women in jail. And so the authorities smashed the window, put in a hose, hosed her down with freezing water until they eventually got in. She tried to kill herself in Holloway. She tried to throw herself down these iron staircases. And then I read somewhere that she decided that it probably wasn't a good idea, that it was a good idea that she hadn't succeeded in Holloway, because if she had, then no one would have known. It would have been hushed up. So I think she then wanted a more public arena. I think, too, that she was always a loose cannon in the suffragette movement, even the more militant arm of the suffragette movement. So I think she often would have these ideas herself. And also I think that there was a story where her mother lived in Morpeth in Northumberland, and there was a story that shortly before the Derby she went out with some farm chaps and got them to race their horses round and round. Of course, these were great big clumping creatures, not sort of amazingly fast race horses that were sort of hammering down. They go, at 30 miles an hour, and then at Tatton Corner it's downhill, so they would be accelerating, so they had no chance of stopping. So I think it was a mixture of her being so brutalised that she just wanted to make her statement, and perhaps hoping she'd get through it, but wanting to do the grand gesture and not caring anymore about what happened to her.
That's Lesley talking about the suffragette who ran out in front of the Derby racehorses. After the travel news, we'll find out what she discovered about Herbert Bertie Jones, that he was one of the earliest sporting celebrities, and how in her novel she imagines him coping with being part of the reason this suffragette died. It's 10:15. You're listening to BBC Radio Kent. We're hearing about a book called The King's Jockey. It's out next month. It's been written by Lesley Gray, who's a student at the University of Kent. Let's find out a little bit about Herbert Bertie Jones. Lesley, you've been talking about what we already know and what you've uncovered about Emily Wilding Davison. How much is known about Herbert Bertie Jones, and how much did you actually have to fictionalise this character?
Not very much at all. It was quite interesting. As I said, he was this footnote in all these history books. And as I looked into him more closely, I realised that he was actually a big celebrity in his day. So he was a bit like a David Beckham or Bobby Charlton. You know, he had a huge following. He was greatly loved by the country, by the people. And he also had this beautiful way with horses. He was a bit of a horse whisperer. And he was known because he rode the King's Horse Diamond Jubilee in the 1900 season, and the Diamond Jubilee was supposed to be the perfect horse, but was as mad as a March hare. So all the fabulous, well-known jockeys, nobody could ride him because the horse would just go bonkers. But Bertie looked after him, so he wasn't really a proper jockey. He was just the guy in the stables who was targeted to look after the Diamond. But the Diamond loved him, so the Diamond was the only. Bertie was the only jockey that the Diamond would let ride. So they took this huge risk. They had to get permission from the then Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, to allow Bertie to ride the Diamond, and he did, and he won the Triple Crown and later became the King's Jockey. So it was a real kind of rags to riches, Black Beauty fairy story which completely captured my imagination. So and then I had to dig around a lot through newspapers at the time and all sorts to try to piece together elements of the man, and it was brilliant because and difficult for a fiction writer because he was so nice. Everybody liked him, and he did a lot of work for charity. He was also there at the sort of advent of celebrity, really, because newspapers were getting interested in the celebrity culture, and he would join in charity matches, a bit like just like celebrities do nowadays on TV. But so he'd be out with Mary Lloyd, who also features in the book, doing sort of Gaiety Girl charity matches, pantomimes and so forth. So he really started to come to life for me, and I thought it was important that people knew his story.
Do you feel sorry for him? Is there much to feel sorry for? Or do you think he coped with this awful incident well? I mean, was he able to carry on riding? Is there any evidence, or does your version of his character give him any long-standing effects?
I think he did carry on. He did carry on racing. In fact, he was up again a couple of weeks later at Ascot, and he was a real kind of, in my view, he was a real sort of trier, he would keep going. And there are various accounts of him being haunted by the suffragette, which I do believe, because I think if he had this great affinity with animals and nature, which I believe he had, and certainly his way with horses was well documented, he must have been a very sensitive soul, because horses are intelligent, graceful creatures who are very sensitive themselves. So I think that he was able to connect with them, showed his own sensitivity and his kindness that was recorded. So my view is that he would have been greatly affected by that.
If it happened nowadays, there'd be counselling, there'd be people diagnosing you with PTSD, there'd be all manner of help, which some people say doesn't really help unless you really want to talk. What was there for a man who went through something like that in those days?
Not a lot, I don't think. I think he just had to struggle on. And I guess there's the macho culture of racing, which is still the case. So he would have just struggled on. But I tried to examine what he might be feeling inside and how he might have found a way through. And I hope that in some way gives some justice and some beauty to what happened to him.
The story is his story, but of course the kind of backbone running underneath it is the fact of Emily Wilding. And you talk about her life and what brought her to the decision, whether it was in that instant or planned, to run out in front of the horses that day. The resonance of that is an interesting one. We're now over 100 years on from that. Some people say feminism isn't needed anymore. Some people say that women's lives have moved on. What do you think?
I think they've certainly moved on, but I think there's still a way to go. I think Millicent Fawcett, who was involved in the suffragist as opposed to the suffragette, the suffragists believed that women should get the vote through persuasion and through passive means, whereas the suffragettes took a more militant view. And there's the Fawcett Society named for her still exists, and they're still doing some tremendous work in trying to make sure that women do have the rights they should, but it's still very hard. And certainly, even in this country, where obviously we're in a developed world, but in the undeveloped world, there's a whole different kettle of fish. So there's a lot to do.
In the library in Tunbridge Wells and the museum upstairs, you were saying that there's an interesting exhibition at the moment about Kent women and their involvement. Is it called Inspiring Women?
It is.
Is it about suffragettes or generally about Kent women who've stood out in some way?
It's basically about the Votes for Women movement and the suffragettes, and Tunbridge Wells and Kent in general had a lot of very feisty women. So there were a huge number of members, and I think I'm right in saying that the cricket pitch in Tunbridge Wells was burnt down by suffragettes. So there was quite a lot of local militancy, and they did the pilgrims up to London, which was a more passive affair. There was the suffragist movement, but so this is looking at the sort of things that they did. They had a headquarters around the corner, and so there's a lot in there, and the pictures are great as well. They really bring it to life, and also it looks at pre-World War I suffrage and suffragette movements, and it also looks at how women's role in World War I helped to raise their cause really, and many would say that it was that got them the partial vote in 1918.
Lesley Gray is the author of The King's Jockey. It's published next month. And Lesley, you're going to be at Tunbridge Wells Library yourself in March, aren't you?
Yes, I'm giving a little talk at the library on Wednesday the 13th of March at 7 p.m. So I gather there's going to be tea and biscuits. So if anyone would like to find out a little bit more, I'd be very happy to see them. We're also selling the books because it's very near Red Nose Day, so we're selling the books, and any proceeds for that will all go to the Red Nose charity.
It's really lovely to meet you. Thank you so much for coming in. I look forward to reading it, The King's Jockey, which is out next month.